There is a contradiction at the center of our modern society that almost no one is taught to notice, not because it's hidden or secret, and not because it requires belief, intuition, or speculation. It exists in plain sight. Most people pass it every day and don't even see it, because noticing it requires holding two opposing ideas at the exact same time, something we're quietly trained not to do. From an early age, we're taught to pick a single form of reasoning, a single authority, and a single acceptable framework. Anything that doesn't fit gets dismissed, not examined. Over time, this becomes automatic. Contradictions are felt briefly, then ignored, not because people are incapable of noticing them, but because they've learned not to dwell their thoughts there. On one side of this contradiction, the public is told that certain things are just downright impossible. We're told that unidentified objects in the sky are misunderstandings or misidentifications, that consciousness is generated entirely by the brain, that anomalous or psychic experiences are fantasy, coincidence, or pathology. Reality, we're told, is mechanical, predictable, and already completely understood. These claims aren't presented as open questions or working models. They're presented as settled conclusions. Questioning them is framed as irrational or unscientific, not through force or censorship, but through tone, labeling, and social pressure. You don't need to be told not to question them. You learn quickly that doing so carries a social cost. On the other side of this contradiction, governments and major institutions quietly spend decades and billions of dollars studying those exact same phenomena. These two positions cannot both be true. If something is impossible, it doesn't receive sustained funding. If something is imaginary, it doesn't receive classified status. If something is delusional, it doesn't generate long-term research, interagency task forces, and internal documentation that spans generations. And yet, that is exactly what has happened. Not once, not briefly, but repeatedly across decades, administrations, and institutions. This is where the series begins because that contradiction reveals something deeper than any single mystery. It exposes a structural divide between what the public is taught as real and what institutions quietly treat as real enough to investigate. This is not a story about aliens, ghosts, or psychic powers. It's a story about how reality is filtered before it reaches public view. Institutions don't reveal their true assumptions through press conferences or official statements. They reveal them through behavior, through what they fund, what they classify, what they restrict, and what they continue to study long after the public has been told to move on. When you examine those behaviors carefully, without ridicule or sensationalism, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that challenges the worldview most people are raised with. For decades, the public narrative insisted that nothing unusual was happening in our skies. Reports of strange craft were explained away as weather balloons, experimental aircraft, sensor errors, or misperception. Popular culture turned this topic into science fiction and parody, and skepticism became a marker of intelligence. At the same time, military pilots, radar operators, and defense systems were documenting objects that did not behave like known aircraft. These objects were tracked visually, tracked on radar, and tracked across multiple sensor systems at the same time. They demonstrated acceleration, maneuverability, and flight characteristics that still exceed known technological limits. They appeared suddenly, moved without observable propulsion, and changed direction in ways conventional aircraft still cannot. Internally, the response to these encounters was not laughter or dismissal. It was organization. It was documentation. It was classification. When something poses no unknown, it doesn't trigger changes in procedure. When something is truly impossible, it doesn't persist across decades of attention. That contradiction isn't a small one, and it doesn't stop with objects in the sky. The same pattern appears again in the study of consciousness. Public education tends to frame consciousness as confined to the brain, an emergent byproduct of neural activity, reducible to chemistry and electrical signals. Subjective experience is treated as secondary, something that happens after the real work is done. At the same time, intelligence agencies funded decades of research into perception, awareness, intuition, altered states, and the limits of human cognition, not because it was philosophical curiosity, because it was operationally relevant, because it was important. It was important enough to be studied under controlled conditions, documented internally, classified when necessary, and taken seriously even when it conflicted with public certainty. This pattern repeats across many different domains. What the public is taught is certainty. What institutions operate within privately is uncertainty, and uncertainty is dangerous to simplified narratives. Certainty creates stability. Certainty creates predictability. Certainty reduces complexity into something manageable. Uncertainty raises questions, and questions destabilize narratives. So, the public receives confidence and closure, while institutions retain flexibility and doubt. This allows systems to function without disruption, even while unresolved questions remain active behind the scenes. This isn't automatically conspiracy, it's standard risk management. When large institutions encounter phenomena that don't fit existing models, they don't announce that reality has been misunderstood. They study it quietly, they compartmentalize it, they distribute information selectively, and they continue forward without rewriting the public story. The result is two parallel realities. One is the official reality, clean, simplified, and stable. The other is the operational reality, complex, unresolved, and adaptive. Most people are raised entirely inside the official one. They're not taught how to evaluate claims independently. They're taught which questions are respectable and which ones signal irrationality. They learn early which topics carry social cost and which ones bring approval. This conditioning doesn't require censorship. It requires repetition. When a topic is consistently framed as ridiculous, curiosity fades. When something is labeled impossible early enough, investigation feels unnecessary. When authority speaks with confidence, doubt begins to feel irresponsible. Over time, people self-regulate their curiosity, not because certain questions are forbidden, but because asking them feels uncomfortable and comes with a social cost. This is how boundaries of thought are maintained without visible enforcement. The filtering happens before questions are even formed. By the time a contradiction appears, most people have already learned not to linger there. The contradiction remains invisible not because it's hidden, but because acknowledging it requires noticing behavior instead of statements. It requires watching what institutions do, not just what they say. It requires tracking patterns across time rather than accepting isolated explanations. And it requires accepting that public certainty and private uncertainty can coexist. This series exists to map the gap carefully, not to tell you what to believe, not to replace one worldview with another, and not to pretend evidence is complete. The goal is much simpler: to slow down long enough to notice patterns that are usually rushed past. Because patterns don't require belief, they require attention. And once attention is applied consistently, certain questions begin to surface on their own. Why investigate what the public is taught to dismiss? Why ridicule alongside classification? Why does certainty increase publicly while uncertainty persists privately? These aren't accusations, they are observations, and once you see them, they are hard to unsee. What we're taught to ignore is often not what's unimportant, but what's unresolved. And unresolved questions aren't dangerous by themselves. What's dangerous is presenting final answers where open questions still exist. Once that realization settles in, the question is no longer whether something is real. The question becomes why certainty was presented where uncertainty still exists. That question is where the series begins.